The new President of the United States, we believe that he must have by now taken the oath of office, although not been advised of this yet, is Lyndon Baines Johnson, a native of Texas, of Johnson City, Texas, where his mother and father had a ranch. He was born there some 54 years ago. He was interested in politics at an early day. When he was still in Southwest Texas State Teachers College, he took law later and became a very early follower of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who who became interested in the young man when he went to Congress in the early days, 1937, of the Roosevelt second term, and Mr. Roosevelt had indeed sponsored him for that job after making him National Youth Administrator in Texas. CBS News correspondent Dan Rather has arrived in our KRLD studio in Dallas. Let's switch now to Dallas for his story.
The whereabouts of Lyndon Baines Johnson at the moment are unknown. Vice President, either soon to be or already President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson was at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas at the time or near the time of the official announcement of the death of the 35th President of this country, John F. Kennedy. Mr. Johnson left the hospital a very short time after 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. That would be 2 o'clock in New York. The Secret Service at this moment, or as of a few moments ago, was saying that Mr. Johnson's whereabouts would not be revealed for security reasons. Most, if not all, of the federal district judges of Dallas and surrounding counties were in and around the motorcade at the time the shooting occurred. We are told that most of the district judges went to Parkland Hospital. It is possible, we are told, that Lyndon Johnson was sworn in some kind of temporary ceremony at the hospital. However, there is no confirmation on that. The fact is, at the moment, the whereabouts of Lyndon Johnson are unknown, the Secret Service says, for security reasons. Mrs. John F. Kennedy left the hospital at approximately the same time the coffin carrying the body of her husband left. The coffin went to a private air installation at Dallas's Love Field. It either has left or will leave Dallas Love Field in a matter of minutes. We are told that the gunshot wound, the fatal wound inflicted on the President of the United States, entered at the base of the throat and came out at the base of the neck on the back side. CBS News correspondent Bob Pierpoint has been at the Parkland Hospital here in Dallas from just a few moments after the time President Kennedy arrived at the hospital and Governor John Connally arrived at the hospital. We expect to have Bob Pierpoint in the studio here with us very shortly. A briefing session for newsmen is anticipated at Parkland Hospital at any moment. Pierre Salinger, the presidential press secretary, presumably will preside over that briefing session. We hope to bring you that briefing session either live from the hospital or on film. At that time, a good deal of the confusion about exactly what happened along the motorcade route here in Dallas at the time President Kennedy was shot and killed should be cleared up. That briefing session we expect to have in a few minutes. Also on the air very shortly, we are hopeful of having some film taken at the Dallas airport at the time of President Kennedy's arrival. Also, CBS News cameraman from Washington, Tommy Cravens, was in the motorcade less than 50 yards from President Kennedy when the shooting occurred. Cameraman Cravens' film is on the premises at this time, being processed. We hope to have that film for you very shortly. What it will show, cameraman Cravens was not at all certain. There is some confusion as to whether a Secret Service man also was killed at the time of the shooting. There has been no official confirmation of any Secret Service man being killed, although there are widespread reports, including one from the Dallas Police Department, that a Secret Service man was killed at the same time President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were shot. The latest word from the hospital on Texas Governor Connally was that Governor Connally was in the operating room and had been seriously, if not critically wounded. That was the last official word that we had from the Dallas Parkland Hospital. As you may know by this time, President Kennedy was shot as he took part in a motorcade which was driving him to the Dallas Trade Mart, which is a big meeting center located just a short way from downtown Dallas. The announcement that the president had been shot was not made at that meeting center until approximately a half hour after the president arrived at the hospital. There was a great deal of grief immediately at the center. There was a great deal of disbelief. In fact, switchboards all over Dallas at anything resembling a public information source are still completely swamped with callers who apparently refuse to believe that John F. Kennedy has been shot and killed. There have been a number of suspects arrested by Dallas police, Dallas County Sheriff's officers. One of the suspects was a 25-year-old white youth. He was the first one arrested. He was in the vicinity of a multi-story building near the scene where President Kennedy and Texas Governor Connally were shot. On the 4th or 5th floor, it has never been completely determined on which floor, of that building, 4 empty cartridges were found. Police immediately ringed that building. They also ringed a 3 or 4 block area around that building, believing that the assassin had fired his shots from the building. A 25-year-old white man was arrested either in or near that building and taken to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office as a suspect. However, our latest report from the Sheriff's Office is that that 25-year-old man is not considered a good suspect. Just a short while ago, near a downtown Dallas theater, a 30-year-old white man was arrested. He had on his person a weapon. At this time, we are not exactly certain as to what kind of weapon it was. It has been reported that a .30 caliber weapon was the one used to kill President Kennedy and to wound Governor Connally. That has not been confirmed. Whether or not the man arrested a few minutes ago at a downtown Dallas theater had on his person a .30 weapon has not yet been confirmed. But the fact is that a 30-year-old white man, meeting the description of one for whom an all points alert was put out shortly after the shooting, has been taken into custody in downtown Dallas. In just a moment, we hope to have the films from the shooting scene just after the shooting occurred by CBS cameraman Tommy Cravens. But while we see if that film is ready and can be shown to you, let's switch back to CBS News headquarters in New York.
There is considerable controversy that has gone on over a good number of years that is going to come up again now under tragic circumstances as to what number should be given to the new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, whether he is the 36th or the 37th President of the United States, even as it was debated whether President Kennedy is properly the 35th or the 36th President. This all stems from the fact that Grover Cleveland served split terms as President of the United States. Mr. President Truman called himself the 34th President of the United States, and President Kennedy called himself the 35th, both believing that Grover Cleveland's 2 non-consecutive terms should be counted as one in counting the number of presidents, and not the total terms should be counted. So on that basis, presumably, President Lyndon Baines Johnson will consider himself the 36th President of the United States. We still, quite oddly it seems to me on this news desk, have had no word from Dallas at all as to the location of Mr. Johnson, nor as to whether or not he has indeed taken the oath of office. It is assumed that he would have from a Dallas judge, a federal judge perhaps then deciding to have another ceremony in Washington with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which was what Calvin Coolidge did when he learned that he had become the President of the United States on his Vermont farm. It seems almost inconceivable that this whole tragic set of circumstances has taken place in these last 3 hours only. It was 12:25 Eastern Standard Time, 11:25 in Dallas, when the shots rang out on that Dallas street, and the life of President Kennedy was snuffed out. We now learn that Vice President Johnson is expected to be sworn in as president aboard an airliner before flying back to the nation's capital. The White House says that Mrs. Kennedy will return to Washington late today to be with the children, Caroline 6 and John Jr., who will be 3 next week. We have word from Dr. Malcolm Perry, the attendant, the surgeon at Parkland Hospital who attended President Kennedy, who says that when he arrived at the emergency room, I noticed the president was in critical condition with a wound of the neck and head. When asked if possibly the wounds could have been made by 2 bullets, he said that he did not know. He said that immediate presumptive measures were taken, and Dr. Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery, was called along with several other members of the staff. Dr. Perry says they arrived immediately, but at this point the president's condition was critical and moribund. A tracheotomy was performed to assist the president's breathing. That's a throat operation. The doctor said an oxygen machine was used, and blood and fluid also were administered. All of this, obviously, to no avail. The president died 25 minutes after the shooting at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Shortly after the news of the president's death, CBS News correspondent Bernard Eisman went out into the streets of New York, and here is his report.
As the news of President Kennedy's death spread through the city, to those who hadn't heard it or had heard only the first fragmentary reports, even this street, which is normally so loud you can't hear yourself talking to another person, acquired a stillness that it's never known. Wherever there was a radio or a television set, people gathered to listen. Can you tell me what your first reaction was, ma'am, when you...
Tragedy that ever happened to this country since President Lincoln.
How about you, sir?
I couldn't believe it, that's all. I just couldn't believe it.
And you, sir? What was your...
I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it.
Who do you think would do something like this?
I don't know. I can imagine in a way. I can imagine.
How about you, sir?
Well, I feel very bad. That's all I can say.
Can you imagine who would do something like this, sir?
Well, I don't think anybody in their right mind. I think this is a terrible thing for our country, not only for our country, but for the entire world. I mean, after all, one does realize that we are striving for peace at the present time, and a thing like this, well, it's just an utter tragedy.
You, sir, do you think that this indicates some sort of an illness in America today?
I don't understand so much.
Thank you very much. Have you been thinking about what's happened in the last few hours, sir?
Yes, I have, and I'm deeply shocked. I'm ashamed this sort of thing can happen in America.
And how about you, sir? Have you had any... What are your first reactions to a tragedy of this sort?
My first reaction, sir, is that I hope these Southerners, these radicals, have satisfied they got their pound of flesh, and killing a man as good as that.
Are you certain that it is right-wing radicals or people who oppose the president so desperately that they would do something like this, who committed this act?
Yes, sir. It could be no one else. Someone who do this must be mentally deranged. No clear-thinking human person would ever think of doing something like that.
How about you, sir? What was your first reaction?
Well, my first reaction was I was terribly shocked. I couldn't believe that it really happened. But I disagree with this man about it being a right-wing radical. It could have been communist, I think, probably something like that.
And how about you, ma'am? What?
We were all crying in my place, all crying.
You look as though you've been crying. Is that how it struck you first?
Yes.
How did you hear about it?
Well, the radio in my place, and they told us.
Did all of the people in the office cry?
Yes.
And the office then was let go and sent home?
Yes.
And how about you, sir? What reaction do you have? How do you feel after a thing like this has happened?
Disgust. Really.
Disgust with...
We have the first films taken in the motorcade just after the assassination shots were heard. Dan Rather has that story in Dallas, Texas.
We are now going to run the films which were taken first at the Dallas airport. These are the films of then Vice President Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, at the Dallas International Airport as they arrived this morning from Fort Worth. Here is the late President John F. Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy coming down the ramp at the Dallas airport. These films were taken slightly less than an hour and a half before President Kennedy was shot and killed in a motorcade in downtown Dallas. The usual receiving line, of course, a number of Dallas dignitaries, and a lady who said that she had waited for 69 years to meet a president. Mrs. Kennedy had been given a bouquet of roses at the Dallas International Airport as a token of affection from the city of Dallas. President Kennedy had looked particularly hale and hearty on this Texas trip. We saw him Monday in Florida, and a number of the White House reporters remarked that he was looking more physically fit than he had at any time over the past year and a half or 2 years. This is part of the motorcade from the Dallas airport toward the downtown area. Shots taken just before the shooting occurred. This is Dallas's Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy was taken after being mortally wounded. The president reportedly was alive when he reached the hospital, but he died a short time after arriving at the hospital. Some efforts were made when the presidential party first arrived at the hospital to keep pictures from being taken. The roses that Mrs. Kennedy had carried earlier were on the back seat of the automobile in which the president was shot. Now, these are scenes at a building across the street from the scene where President Kennedy was shot. Police immediately ranged this building. It's believed that the assassin was in this same building on either the 4th or 5th floor. Some empty cartridges have been found in that building. Witnesses said they believe 3 or 4 shots were fired. 4 empty cartridges were found in the building, which had been ringed by police. A number of suspects were picked up immediately. Practically anyone in the area who even gave a hint of looking suspicious was picked up. Considerable confusion in the immediate vicinity. Right there was the spot where the president was shot. This is part of the police contingent arriving to surround the building. Police thought they might be able to catch the assassin still in the building. They were unsuccessful in that. Police were heavily armed. They ranged not only the building, but about a 3-block area around this building, which, as I say, is located directly across from where the president was shot. This is practically the spot on the street where the president was shot. These pictures were taken just after the president had been taken to a hospital. Police made a systematic search of the building. They found no weapon. Up there on the 4th or 5th floor, perhaps out of one of those open windows, is where the assassin of President Kennedy is believed to have fired the fatal shots. We have no further information as yet from the hospital on the condition of Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding with President Kennedy and who also was critically wounded. Our last report from Parkland Hospital was that Governor Connally was in the operating room, that he was still alive but was in critical condition. Walter, you mentioned a short while ago that it was difficult to understand why we had not been appraised of the whereabouts of Lyndon Johnson, who will, of course, step up to the presidency in light of the tragic death today of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We are in direct contact with Parkland Hospital. We're also in direct contact with Dallas Police and the FBI. We have a reporter with the Secret Service agents, and the word from all sources is that Mr. Johnson, his whereabouts are being kept secret for security reasons. If anyone knows where Mr. Johnson is, it is not us at this moment.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. As a matter of fact, we just got the word from our reporters out there at the airport, bypassing you just as you were on the air at that last moment, that Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. He was sworn in at 1:38 Central Standard Time. That was 2:38, and that's almost an hour and a half ago now, if this time is correct here. The oath was administered to him by U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes. He took the oath aboard the presidential plane at Love Field just prior to takeoff to return to Washington. The president's body is to be returned to Washington also, along with Mrs. Kennedy. She will accompany it, and that plane is supposed to arrive back at Andrews Air Force Base, we're told now, at 5:25 this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. That's about an hour and a half from now. Whether that is the same plane in which now President Johnson is returning, we do not know. The presidential oath as Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, took it, reads, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." And now President Johnson is flying back to Washington to actively take over the reins of government. 6 of President Kennedy's cabinet who were on the route to Japan have turned around at mid-ocean and are flying back to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother, who was often mentioned as a possible candidate himself someday for the highest office of the land, is in Washington. So was Senator Ted Kennedy, his youngest brother. He was on the floor of the Senate, presiding, as a matter of fact, in the Senate. As the word came, he dashed from the Senate and is now en route to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, to be with his and the late president's mother and father there. We understand that the president's sister, Mrs. Sergeant Shriver, wife of the administrator of the Peace Corps, was flying away from Washington too, and the first thought was that she perhaps was going to Texas to be with her brother before she learned of his death. We do not know where she is now destined. We will now pause for 10 seconds so that our stations may identify themselves.
Is Channel 2.
The assassination of President Kennedy has been reported, of course, in some detail here since the historic shots rang out in the streets of Dallas, Texas at 12:25 noon today. It seems barely possible that that was just some 3.5 hours ago. The president lived for 35 minutes after being rushed to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. He died there at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, at noon Dallas time today. The 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, 54-year-old native of Texas, a former senator, former member of Congress, former administrator of the National Youth Administration under President Roosevelt in Texas, has taken the oath of office aboard an airplane at Love Field in Dallas and is en route back to Washington. The president's body is flying back to Washington also, accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy. The president's wife was in the open limousine along with Governor Connolly of Texas and his wife when the shots were fired from an assassin's rifle in apparently the 4th or 5th floor of a building overlooking the motorcade route that was taking the president from Dallas Airport to downtown Dallas for a speech at noon. The president was hit in the head and the neck. Whether by one bullet, however, or two has not been clarified. Governor Connolly was hit in the chest. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connolly were not hit by the bullets. A report that a Secret Service man was killed has not been clarified either. In Dallas, a Dallas policeman just a short while ago was shot and killed while chasing a suspected to the assassination in a Dallas theater. The man pulled a gun, shot one policeman, wounded another, but was captured. And when he was captured, he yelled, "It's all over now," and screaming hysterically was taken into custody by the police. Of course, we have no information whether this man is the assassin or not. A vast dragnet has gone out throughout the Dallas area for any possible suspects to the criminal act in Dallas today. Former presidents of the United States, Truman, Hoover, and Eisenhower, as far as we know, have all been informed. At Independence, Kansas, Mrs. Truman said that President Truman was too shaken up to make any comment at the moment. We have not heard from former President Hoover, who is at the Waldorf Tower suite in which he lives, but has made no comment as yet. Former President Dwight David Eisenhower also is in New York, and his statement is this: "I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's president. Mrs. Eisenhower and I also join with all other citizens in expressing our personal grief and prayerful concern to Mrs. Kennedy and all other members of the family." That statement from former President Eisenhower. In Boston, Massachusetts, the late president's home, Richard Cardinal Cushing, a lifelong friend of the Kennedy family, made plans to leave immediately for Hyannisport to be with Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy and the president's mother, Mrs. Rose Kennedy. The Cardinal officiated at the marriage of President Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy in 1953. It will be a particularly poignant time for the Kennedy family next week. The two Kennedy children both have birthdays next week. John, 3, November the 25th, and Caroline, 6, on November the 27th. An entire nation has almost come to a stop today in the wake of the horrible news. The stock market, after getting the first news before it was known that the president had died, prices began to plummet, and the New York Stock Exchange and all other commodity and stock exchanges across the country closed. In New York, all the theaters were immediately darkened and will not open tonight. Schools were let out across the country. We reported to you on the arrest of that individual in Dallas. He is being grilled now. He's said to be 24 years old. A name has been given for him by Dallas police as Leo H. Oswald, although, as the Dallas police themselves say, there is no information as yet that he is the assassin. He was being chased as a possible suspect, however, when he did pull a gun, and he killed a Dallas policeman at that moment. A tragic day in the city. We still haven't heard definitely whether a Secret Service man died in the fusillade of shots. That was the rumor, but rumors do spread rapidly at a time like this, and there's no proof that that actually took place as yet. We learn now that definitely Mrs. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the new First Lady, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy are accompanying President Johnson back to Washington in the presidential plane. They left Dallas just a short while ago. They're due back in Washington at approximately 5:30, we are told, at which time President Johnson will have to take into his hands the reins of the most powerful nation in the world. President Johnson, as you know, is 54 years old, native of Texas, of a city called Johnson City, Texas, which is a little bit west of Austin, Texas, where Mrs. Johnson has radio and television interests, our affiliate station there. She has other television radio stations in Texas. President Johnson has been interested in politics since he was a Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He studied law. He went to Congress in 1937 after having served as National Youth Administrator in Dallas under President Roosevelt. He was a favorite of President Roosevelt's, was a New Dealer in the early days of the New Deal, although his politics had turned somewhat more conservative over the recent years. He had sought the presidential nomination that was won by President Kennedy. and was probably had about as good a chance as any of the runners-up when President Kennedy, then a senator from Massachusetts, swept the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960. It was a surprise when President Kennedy announced that Lyndon Johnson was his choice for vice president, and it was thought that he brought him into the ticket primarily to help swing a recalcitrant South, including the rather important state with a heavy electoral vote, the state of Texas. It was in Texas today where President Kennedy, after 3 years of that administration, met his death. Eric Severide has just moved in. Eric, do you have a word or two?
Walter, I thought perhaps that we might talk a little about the new President of the United States. I've been trying to put down a few notes about the life and the nature of Lyndon Baines Johnson, a man that our thoughts will be upon very soon. He is 55, Walter, not 54. He was born in August of 1908. He's really in the prime of life for the responsibilities of the presidency, at a point where a man's experience and his energies meet at a rather high mutual level. He was born in Texas, near that hamlet called Johnson City, and the family flag flies there over the LBJ Ranch. He is a lawyer by education, a politician by instinct, and by great success. He was a very young aide to President Roosevelt during the New Deal days, working on youth projects. He first went to the House of Representatives in 1937 when he was only 29 years old, and he became the protege of Sam Rayburn, the great Texan who ran the House as Speaker longer than any man in our history, including Henry Clay. Johnson went to the Senate in 1949. He won in Texas by a very tiny majority vote of 87, actually, and he became without much doubt the most effective majority leader in the history of the Senate. His energy was prodigious. He lived always in a whirl of activity, and he put most senators in his personal debt by one service or another. His fame in Washington itself became very great during those Eisenhower years when he led the opposition majority in the Senate, and his power at that time was considerably greater than it was, his real political power, than in these years when he has been the vice president. Johnson has been called by some a liberal by conviction and intellect, a conservative by geography. His political alliances in Texas were with the more conservative Texas Democrats who have managed the state for a good many years. But in most national matters, he was always regarded as what we call a progressive, including on the issue of civil rights. And this again was in the pattern and the image of his protege, Sam Rayburn. He is a fairly wealthy man. The family holdings, some in the name of his wife, Lady Bird, include television stations as well as that family ranch. In 1955, when Mr. Johnson was making a Sunday visit to the farm of George McGee, another Texan, now an ambassador, that was near Washington, Johnson was hit rather hard with a heart attack. He thought at first it was only acute indigestion. Senator Clinton Anderson of New Mexico was there at the time for this luncheon, and he said at once, "You have had a heart attack." Johnson was taken to a hospital, and he slowly recovered. For some time after that, his strength was considerably diminished. I remember him telling reporters once that on Monday morning he said, "I'm full of energy. By Wednesday night, I'm tired out." But all that changed. His full strength came back, and in recent years he has demonstrated his old energies, and they're great energies, in a daily whirl of activities, including a good many trips around this country and abroad. He is now personally acquainted with all the world leaders that the president was acquainted with, including Mr. Khrushchev. And his grasp of domestic politics, of course, is quite profound at the general and intellectual level, as well as the practical working level of the total human machinery that makes our rather cumbrous system work. His fierce fight against Kennedy for the nomination in 1960 now seems only yesterday to most of us. His great prestige in Washington itself was not at that time matched by his prestige and his fame in the country at large. This was a great struggle right down to those final hours in the convention. And then Mr. Kennedy chose Johnson to be his running mate, partly because he had to have the South. And Johnson was regarded as the one man who could conciliate the Southern conservatives, and this he did. And there were some who said later that Mr. Kennedy really owed his election to Lyndon Johnson. In any case, Johnson has never shown any jealousy whatsoever, any kind of bitterness. He became the president's lieutenant in full fidelity, in private as well as in public.
But as vice presidents do, certainly under a very energetic and active president, he slowly faded from national consciousness. And when the president died today, he and Mr. Kennedy were in, the president and the vice president were engaged behind the scenes in Texas in trying to settle a rather fierce feud within the Texas Democratic Party between the Johnson-Connolly forces and the liberal groups led by Senator Ralph Yarborough. All that, of course, now seems petty and of no consequence in retrospect. It doesn't matter. Mr. Johnson is the president, and Texas will be his personal political base in toto. And when the sorrow of today begins to fade, when the president has been laid to rest, the machinery of the national government will take up again, and again Americans will have to think ahead, not only to what lines of policy and action the new president will follow, but, of course, also to the election of next year. Mr. Johnson will be nominated next August at the Democratic Convention if he wishes it, and I'm sure most observers would predict now that he will wish it. All estimations on the outcome of that election next November, of course, are now rather without meaning. The election, like the course of this great country itself, now lies with fate and the continuing nature of our times and in our world. And now back, Walter, to you. Eric, that matter that you suggested a little earlier on this afternoon of the danger of a violent reaction to the right wing in America, assessing very probably improperly the assassination as being the responsibility resting there already is beginning to come to light. You saw perhaps, or maybe you were busy.
I missed that, Walter.
Well, did some interviews in the streets of New York, and 2 or 3 people were laying the blame right there.
It's much too early for that sort of thing.
Oh, of course it is. The Soviet Union, however, is doing that. TOSS has announced that extreme right-wing elements were undoubtedly to blame.
This will be tragic if anything of this court either takes possession of people's minds, particularly if there's any truth in it.
Right. We now have some new film in at our Washington Bureau, so let's switch back to Washington now and Neil Strauser.
Washington, Walter, is still in a state of shock, except for those departments responsible for seeing to the smooth transition of the presidency from Mr. Kennedy to Mr. Johnson. Almost no work is being done. Most federal and District of Columbia workers are being sent home an hour early. On Capitol Hill, almost all of the comments contain the words tragic loss, disastrous. First word of the shooting was carried to the Senate floor by Richard Rydell, a press liaison aide whose job it is to watch the tickers in the Senate cloakroom and keep senators up to date on world happenings. Rydell tells of his fateful mission.
Well, the routine, the tickers in the lobby, AP and UP tickers, are read by senators and staff members for routine information. Phyllis Rock of the staff of Senator Morse of Oregon was in the lobby by herself reading the ticker. She turned to one of my assistants, Tom Pelican, who is with Senator Long of Missouri in his office part of the time, and said the president has been shot. Tom rushed out to tell me. I immediately went into the Senate chamber, in front of the desk of Majority Leader Senator Mike Mansfield, raised my voice so that he and the senators, the surrounding desk, could hear, and said, "Senators, the president has been shot." It, of course, was like a shock wave, a jolt. I crossed the aisle to the Republican side, where Senator Dirksen was seated, and in the same manner told Senator Dirksen and the Republican senators who were at adjacent desks, with, of course, the same shocked reaction and stunned expression on their faces. I then happened to recall that a few moments before, the president's brother, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, was presiding over the Senate. I turned and he was still occupying the chair. I knew that someone would have to inform him. And I thought I might as well. It was a very difficult job because of the family relationship as well as the friendship of the senators to the president. I rushed up to the chair and said, Senator Kennedy, your brother, the president, has been shot. He gave a jerk of his body tensed, but he was absolutely calm. And as I recall, Senator Kennedy, then presiding over the Senate, when he heard this awful news, said no. And that was all. In an orderly manner, he gathered up the papers on his desk that his routine office work that he brings when he presides over the Senate, so that he can conserve the time, the long hours presiding over the Senate by working at his office work. I walked off the rostrum with him with my arm around Senator Kennedy, patting his shoulders, and said, Senator, if there's anything any of us can do, let us know. My own suggestion would be that you contact the Air Force and have them rush you out to Texas to your brother's side in a jet, in a military jet. He said, thank you. I'm going to call the White House and the Attorney General. Whereupon, by that time, we had reached a phone in the lobby, and he immediately put in calls to the White House and to the Department of Justice, seeking all the information and contact with his brother, a good friend, Bobby Kennedy.
Of course, that trip to Dallas, Texas proved unnecessary. Senator Edward Kennedy and his sister Eunice Shriver later this afternoon flew red-eyed and somber to Hyannisport, Massachusetts to be with their parents. The late president's youngest brother and his sister, the wife of the Peace Corps director, arrived at Andrews Air Force Base at 3:20 p.m. by helicopter and within minutes had boarded a jet for Cape Cod to be with the ailing former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy and Mrs. Rose Kennedy. This is Neil Strasser in Washington.
And now let's switch back to Dallas, Texas, where Dan Rather is standing by. Dan?
Walter, we have some additional film taken at and near Parkland Hospital, where President John Kennedy died. This film is in rough cut form. These are some of the witnesses in the area of the shooting. There was a great deal of disbelief at first that the president had even been shot, and even more disbelief that he was dead. This is in the area of the emergency room of the hospital, I believe. We have Eddie Barker, news director of KRLD Television and Radio, our affiliate in Dallas. Eddie, this is near the emergency room of the hospital, is it not?
Yes, Dan, that is correct, and that's the Secret Service agent there who is talking to the crowd. We talked to some people who we would consider as very good sources. This is when they were getting ready to leave the hospital, and it was very difficult to get any film because Secret Service agents were quite adamant in keeping everyone back a good distance from... This is Senator Yarborough here, I believe.
Senator Yarborough was one of the first to get the word of the president's death.
Right.
He is a Democrat of Texas, Senator Ralph Yarborough.
Right. This is Father Huber from Holy Trinity Church in Dallas, who administered the last rites to the president. There were two priests in attendance, and I do not know the other one's name at this time. There were shocked people all around, as you can see from these crowds, many of them hospital employees.
Quite a large crowd gathered at the hospital.
Yes. There was quite a traffic jam out there.
These scenes are at Parkland Hospital
That's
in
correct.
Dallas, where President John Kennedy died.
Dan, I don't know whether you are aware of this or not. Mrs. Kennedy maintained her composure, we understand, up until the time that she actually went into the room where the president's body lay, and she said, "Jack, Jack, no, no," were the words that she used. She rode from the hospital to the airport in the back section of the hearse. It was a cream-colored hearse belonging to a local funeral home here. The curtains were drawn, but as the hearse left, Mrs. Kennedy could be seen in the back. And the president's body was airborne at 47 minutes past 2 o'clock.
At Central
Texas
Standard Time.
Yes.
We covered Mrs. Kennedy yesterday in San Antonio as she arrived with her husband and the Lyndon Johnsons. There had been some reports from the White House press corps that Mrs. Kennedy was reluctant to make the Texas trip. It had been billed in many quarters as strictly a political trip, and as Mrs. Kennedy arrived in San Antonio, she at first appeared to be rather ill at ease. But later in the day, she seemed to warm up to the occasion, and I noticed today in both Fort Worth and Dallas that she really seemed to be enjoying herself. I think with Mrs. Kennedy there was some reluctance to come to the state because people would tell her, well, they're different kind of people. But she did seem to be enjoying herself thoroughly throughout the day. Eyewitnesses at the shooting say that in the early moments, immediately after the shooting, that the president's head was in Mrs. Kennedy's lap, and that Mrs. Kennedy did restrain herself, did have her composure until the time she went to the hospital where the president, then dead, was.
She walked out of the hospital, Dan, under her own power. There was no one, from where we were standing, there was no one holding onto her arm. She walked out. She was hatless when she came out of the emergency exit and got into the hearse that bore the body to the airport.
Eddie, a lot of questions are going to be asked about what kind of place is Dallas, Texas. Just recently there was the publicity about the city and the rough reception that the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, got here. There was the occasion in which he was spat upon and hit with a picket sign. I think Mayor Cabell only yesterday made a statement saying that the city was quite anxious to give President Kennedy an especially warm welcome because of that incident. But there are going to be a lot of questions asked in the coming days about what kind of place is Dallas, Texas, a place in which this could happen. You're a long-time resident here, and in the eyes of many, sort of Mr. Dallas. Could you tell us what kind of place this is?
Dan, it's actually it's a very fine place, and it's a very fine city, and I know the city fathers have discussed this at great length. There is an element that has developed here in the past few years that considers itself a wing very much to the right, to the far right, and this is certainly a very small minority. I know today at the luncheon that the president was to have attended, and we were looking over the people who were there, and there were many Republicans, there were many conservative Democrats, but they were all out to welcome and honor the office of the President of the United States. And this is something that certainly this city is going to be living with for a long time, but this does not in any way reflect the great majority of the people here. Politics in this town are different, certainly, than they are in a lot of places. There are many factions of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, as you know, is very strong. We have a Republican congressman. We had a situation here a few years back. You may remember when Senator Johnson had his, then Senator Johnson had his problems in one of the downtown hotels.
That was in the 1960 campaign.
Yes, but this is a minority group, and certainly is not a reflection of this community. Many of these leaders, I'll say in closing, when the word came today at the market, at the Trade Mart, that the president was dead, they broke down and cried. It was a very moving thing.
We're going to switch now from Dallas, Texas, back to CBS News headquarters in New York.
The news, as you know it, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas today. 12:25, he was shot in a motorcade en route to a speech in Dallas from the Dallas airport and died 35 minutes later. Lyndon Baines Johnson, 55-year-old vice president, took the oath of office in an airplane at Love Field and is flying back to Washington to take the reins of government. Governor John Connally of Texas was shot also and is in serious condition at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Charles Collingwood, if you want to come in and relieve me a little while, we are here at CBS News going to stay on the air throughout this day to bring you details as we have them. That presidential plane is expected back in Washington now, we're told, at 6:05 with the president's body. Charles?
As Walter Cronkite has told you, the Vice President, the former Vice President, the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is on his way back to Washington after having been sworn in the executive compartment of the same plane which brought President Kennedy to Dallas, Texas this morning. President Johnson was sworn in by Judge Sarah Hughes, a federal judge in Texas, who wept with emotion as she administered the oath of office to the Vice President by which he became the President of the United States. At the ceremony, Mrs. Johnson, who had accompanied the President on the tour of Texas, was there, as were various staff members, congressmen who were present, and all those with some official capacity or who could be brought into the ceremony. It's in the nature of things, of our presidential succession, that the emphasis, the spotlight, is now upon the new president. No one is ever prepared for an event of this kind. Not the Secret Service, which can only take the most effective precautions possible and can never safeguard against some twisted person who can circumvent the most careful precautions that can be taken. Not the public, certainly, not the officials of government. But the machinery for the succession to the presidency of the United States has been well tested over the years. And thus it was that less than 2 hours after the president's death, Vice President Johnson was sworn in the plane which brought the president to Texas and which took another president back to Washington, D.C. Also en route to Washington in the air is the president's body, accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy, who was in the same automobile with him when the assassin's bullet was fired in Texas, in Dallas, Texas, this morning. We continue to have reports, fragmentary and confused still, as the law enforcement machinery in Texas, on both the state, the city, and the federal level, are engaged in trying to find the person or persons responsible for the bullet which was fired from the building which overlooked the route by which the cavalcade followed as the president, the governor of Texas, the vice president, Senator Yarborough, assorted dignitaries, moved from downtown Texas to a trade mart on the outskirts. A bulletin here from Dallas says that Governor John Connally of Texas, wounded by the sniper who assassinated President Kennedy, was described this afternoon as being in a very, very serious but not critical condition. Julian Reed, an aide to Governor Connally, said that Connally suffered 3 wounds, one in the right arm, one in the right leg, and one in the back that pierced his body. Julian said that Connally had been in surgery an hour and probably would be there for another hour. Now, for a report from our mobile unit in Chicago, we go to Chicago and Russ Bensley.
The flagstaff tells the story at the corner of State and Madison Streets. Beneath it, the bright lights, the Christmas demonstrations, but they have no joy today. Here in Chicago, the crowds who came downtown to shop are standing around in silence and sorrow in the rain. And the strange thing is, you don't even notice it's raining. And if you do notice, you don't care. Most of those who have talked to us here share the universal feeling of shock. Some have a feeling of anger. And we thought we'd let you hear how they feel. Sir, how did the news of President Kennedy's death affect you?
As a man of God, I would say that I felt the impact of the sniper's bullet. I would also say that I felt the pain that the president had in his dying moments. Thank you.
You, sir?
I'm shocked, very shocked at this. We read about many countries losing their heads of government through assassination, but I never dreamed that it would ever happen to our head of government. I'm very sad indeed.
Thank you. How do you feel, sir?
It was once said that history repeats itself. Look at Abe Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. The rain you see here in Chicago is not rain, it's emotion.
Sir, how do you feel?
Well, I feel shocked. I can hardly express my emotion, and I hope that the country will survive.
Ma'am?
I can't sit up.
Sir?
I just couldn't believe it when I heard it. We were in school. All of a sudden, we were just told the president was dead. Didn't seem possible.
How do you feel now?
Like a daze. You don't know what's going on. Why? Why did it happen? Who would have done such a thing is the question.
Sir?
This is a dark day in the history of America. This man, I think, wanted to save America. He is not dead. His spirit lives. We are sorry, deeply moved over this incident here in America. I'm sorry.
I just can't believe it. I feel like someone in my own family is dead. I just can't believe it.
Feels like a loss in the own family, and I think it's a great loss to America.
I came up the street, and I thought, no, it's not true. We are not without our president. We live in a Christian country. President Kennedy was a Christian. Please God, help his wife, his family, give strength to his mother and his ailing father. We will miss a great friend and a true Christian.
We will all miss one of the greatest presidents that ever was. Thank you.
I was shocked when I heard it, and, well, they closed the city hall in respect to him. Everyone else is truly sorry it happened. And that's all.
Ma'am, how did the news affect you?
I was shocked, deeply shocked. We've lost a very good president. He was for the poor people, and that's what we need, a president like that.
Those are typical reactions in Chicago, and I imagine they're fairly typical of the reactions across the country. It is several hours now since the news broke, and the mind still reels at accepting the fact. And it will continue to be an incredible tragedy for days to come. This is how Chicago feels. This is how the nation feels. This is Russ Bensley in Chicago, now back to CBS News in New York.
That same sense of grief and disbelief is being expressed today all over the world by great people as well as by small ones. We have some late film now from Dallas, Texas, and so for that film we switch now to Dan Rather in Dallas.
As we mentioned a short while ago, a number of arrests have been made in Dallas in the wake of President Kennedy's death. We have scenes of one of those arrests in the downtown area. This was just after a Dallas policeman was shot in the vicinity of a downtown movie house. The suspect was brought immediately to police headquarters. That particular suspect is among many who is being questioned, not all of them in connection with the shooting. Some of the suspects simply are being questioned as possibly to what they saw. The Dallas Police Headquarters is literally alive with people who have been brought in off the streets, arrested for one cause or another.
Dan, there's a report that an arrest has been made in Fort Worth also of a suspect.
Eddie Barker of our affiliate station KRLD, who was in Dallas, who was covering the president's arrival today. At least a half dozen suspects, people identified as suspects by police, have been picked up here in Dallas. We also have the first films that we've had available of the Parkland Hospital. Well, these are films of a pistol taken off one suspect in the downtown area. Now, early reports said that the president had been shot with a .30 caliber weapon of some description, but that particular pistol was taken off of a suspect arrested in the downtown area. We have the films taken at Parkland Hospital at the time the ambulance carrying the body of President Kennedy. I believe these are arrival films, are they not? This is...
No, this is when they're getting ready to leave, I believe, Dan.
The group, the presidential party coming out of the hospital.
Yes.
Those particular people cannot be identified. They were part of the presidential party.
The President's secretary, Mrs. Lincoln, came out about this time, but I'm not sure if that is her.
This is the scene at Dallas's Parkland Hospital as the body of President Kennedy was brought out and taken to Dallas's Love Field to be flown to Washington. The body is now en route by plane to Washington. Also en route to Washington is the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. It was quite a crowd at the Parkland Hospital at this time when the President's body was taken away, but most of the crowd was away from that particular section of the hospital. Earlier today, down in Uvalde, Texas, former Vice President John Nance Garner celebrated his 95th birthday. Mr. Garner refused to grant any interview as such, but in the course of a conversation with reporters, this was some 2 hours before President Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas. Former Vice President under Franklin Roosevelt, John Nance Garner, said he felt that President Kennedy might become one of the great presidents of this country. Former Vice President Garner, a longtime friend of Lyndon Johnson. This is another scene at Dallas Police Headquarters, suspects being brought in, suspects rounded up in practically all sections of town. We mentioned earlier that some rifle shells were found in an upper story of a multi-story building right across the street from where President Kennedy was shot. Police ringed that building and made a systematic search of it, but they did not arrest any suspect inside the building. Police have taken a number of weapons off persons that they believe to have been in the crowd. It has not been definitely determined that a .30 caliber weapon was the weapon used to kill President Kennedy. Those were the early reports, and Dallas police are working on that theory at the moment. We have a statement that has been issued by the Dallas Citizens Council, the Dallas Assembly, and the Science Research Center of Dallas. This statement is signed by Mr. J.E. Johnson, President of the Dallas Citizens Council, Mr. W. Dawson Sterling, President of the Dallas Assembly, and Dr. Lloyd V. Berkner, who is President of the Science Research Center. And the statement says, "Our hearts are filled with sorrow. We are deeply distressed and grieved that the respectful and enthusiastic welcome in progress for our President was terminated by an act of lunacy." This is Dan Rather in Dallas, Texas, with Eddie Barker, back now to CBS News headquarters in New York.
While the new President of the United States, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, sworn in the executive cabin of the presidential plane within 2 hours after President Kennedy's death. While the new president is flying back to Washington, reports come in from all over the world of the universal sense of shock, grief, and disbelief with which the news of the president's assassination was greeted. In England, British television stations told their viewers tonight that President Kennedy had been killed and then suspended regular broadcasts. The British Broadcasting Corporation and the Independent Television Network went on the air playing funeral music in honor of the president. All in small groups and in large ones and individuals all over Europe. This sense of grief and heartbreak was expressed. President Charles de Gaulle said that President Kennedy died like a soldier under fire for his duty and in the service of his country. De Gaulle went on, "In the name of the French people, ever the friend of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory." Other European leaders joined in similar tributes. In this country, former President Harry S. Truman, who himself succeeded to the presidency on the death of President Roosevelt, and who himself was an intended victim of assassins' bullets 13 years ago, President Truman was too stricken by the news of President Kennedy's assassination to comment immediately, but Mrs. Truman said that the former president would issue a statement later. Truman was at his home in Independence when he heard the news of President Kennedy's death. Richard Nixon, who ran against President Kennedy for the presidency of the United States, said, "The assassination of the president is a terrible tragedy for the nation. Mrs. Nixon and I have sent a personal message expressing our deepest sympathy to the members of the family in this hour of sorrow. In Washington, the nation's leaders of both parties expressed their grief and sorrow. For that report, we go now to Neil Strasser in Washington.
We now have film of the reaction of the Democratic and the Republican leaders of the Senate. Democrat Mike Mansfield and Republican Everett Dirksen met newsmen together in a show of bipartisan sorrow at the death of our chief of state. We hear first from Senator Dirksen.
There are some things that are simply incredible and leave one absolutely speechless. This is one of them. I knew John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a representative, as a senator, and as a president for 14 years or more. And my last visit with him was on Tuesday morning of this week. I went early to present him with a turkey from the Turkey Growers Association. He was so amiable, so affable, so agreeable, and he looked in the very pink of condition, notwithstanding a rather rugged tour in the state of Florida. The thing that stuck in my mind most when suddenly he shouted to a lot of school children and to those managing this live turkey, "Don't take the turkey away until the children have had a chance to come up and see it." We visited about many things: politics, bills pending in Congress, the future, 1964, and everything that one can encompass within a half-hour visit. And suddenly comes this mortal blow that strikes him cold in death. I say it's an incredible thing. And my heart goes out to the family. And I'm a little bewildered by this turn of events, as I know the nation and the whole wide world will be. So first, my sincere sympathy to the entire Kennedy family. And in the language of the chaplain, as we had a prayer, in the hope that transfusion might infuse recovery, that the nation still stands and the nation will live.
And the majority leader of the Senate, Mike Mansfield.
The passing of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is not only a tragedy for the nation which he so ably represented, but is, I think, also a mark upon the respectability and the responsibility of some of our citizens. This good, this decent, this kindly man, this harassed man who had so much on his shoulders and received from some people so little in the way of support in return, this man has now gone to his reward. And I will miss him as a personal friend. The nation will miss him as a great president. And the world will miss him as a great leader. One of the fondest memories I can recall is the cooperation and the support which the distinguished senator from Illinois, Mr. Dirksen, the minority leader of the Senate, gave to the President of the United States, a Democrat, time and time again when the interests of the nation were at stake. And I know how grateful he was to you for the many contributions you made, and I'm just as grateful, and the nation is too. Words are useless to express one's true feelings at a moment like this.
Mike, a person's perplexity is just too great in a tragic moment like this.
In this time of tragedy, there are no political differences. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, the Republican many thought might be opposing President Kennedy, the late President Kennedy, in 1964, has issued this statement through his Washington office. It is both shocking and dreadful that a thing like this could happen in a free country. The president's death is a profound loss to the nation and the free world. He and I were personal friends. It is also a great loss to me. Mrs. Goldwater and I offer our heartfelt sympathies to Mrs. Kennedy and the president's family. As for members of the president's family, Paul Niven reports from the Attorney General Robert Kennedy's home in McLean that the Attorney General learned of the shooting while he was at lunch with Robert Morgenthau, the unsuccessful candidate for governor. last year in New York. Attorney General Kennedy was told by J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, a priest later visited the house. Another visitor was CIA's Chief John McCone. Both of them walked in the garden for several minutes. Mrs. Ethel Kennedy left home briefly to get the children, probably from school. When they returned, the Attorney General met them at the door and gathered one of his daughters in his arms. There has been no statement from the Attorney General. Local police are protecting the home. Caroline Kennedy, who observes her 6th birthday anniversary next Wednesday, and her brother John Jr., who observes his 3rd on Monday, were in the White House today when their father was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. It is believed that their mother, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, was faced with the task of telling them what happened. She, of course, is returning on the plane with the president's body. Will be back in Washington later tonight. The president's youngest brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, first heard about the shooting on the Senate floor while he was presiding over the Senate. We now have films of Senator Kennedy as he arrived at Andrews Air Force Base and boarded a jet flying to Hyannisport, Maryland, to be with the president's ailing father, the late president's ailing father, Joseph Kennedy, and Mrs. Rose Kennedy. And that's the story as we have it at this time in Washington. This is Neil Strasser reporting.
As silent and weeping crowds gather outside the White House in Washington, summoned by the tragedy, the flag of the White House flies at half-mast. It was lowered within moments after word of the president's death was received. We have reports from all over this country, all over the world, of the shock at what transpired in Dallas, Texas this morning. New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a would-be opponent of President Kennedy in the election in 1964, has called President Kennedy's death a shock and a terrible tragedy. Rockefeller immediately canceled a political trip which he was to have made to New Hampshire, where he is taking part in the primary campaign in that state, which had been scheduled to begin on Sunday. Governor Rockefeller has ordered that the flags on all New York State buildings be lowered to half-staff for the next 30 days. Rockefeller has ordered all public state ceremonies scheduled within the next few days to be canceled. More bulletins come in from Dallas, Texas, as they have been all afternoon, talking about the efforts to apprehend the assassin. Police today seized one man, Lee H. Oswald, whom you probably already heard. He is identified as chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee and is regarded, at least as far as we know, as the prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. Such is the nature of the American system for the presidential succession that shortly after President Kennedy's death was announced, Vice President Johnson was sworn in an impromptu ceremony in the executive cabin of the presidential plane, the very plane that had carried President Kennedy to Dallas this morning. The new chief executive took the oath of office at 2:39 p.m. Central Time, that's Dallas time, 3:39 p.m. Eastern Time, and for the first time in history, the oath was administered by a woman, U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes. Johnson was sworn in on the Air Force No. 1, the presidential plane, and he then flew on to Washington. He's now en route, airborne to Washington, to take up the duties of chief executive of the United States, duties which cannot wait upon sorrow or tragedy. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson were both present at the swearing-in of President Johnson. So were several congressmen, White House staff members who accompanied the presidential trip. Johnson asked as many of the White House people who were there as possible to crowd into the plane to witness the ceremony. Judge Hughes wept as she administered the traditional presidential oath to President Johnson. And then the plane took off immediately for Washington with Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Kennedy, and some White House aides aboard. President Kennedy's body is following on another plane. Vice President Johnson is a figure who has not been without controversy in our system. He himself had tried for the presidency in 1960, accepted the vice presidency when it was the vice presidential nomination when it was offered to him by President Kennedy. and has been a loyal aide in the last 3 years to President Kennedy, submerging his own ambitions in many ways, his own personality, to help the president carry on the programs to which he was pledged. Many statements are coming in from all over the world. An eloquent one from France by General de Gaulle, who said that, in soldierly language, that President Kennedy had died like a soldier by fire in the battle which he waged. Here is a statement which has just come in from J. Irwin Miller, President of the National Council of Churches. And we have a report now which has to do with a news conference at Parkland Hospital, a report on the condition of Governor John Connally of Texas, so we switched to that.
The scene is the Parkland Hospital at Dallas, Texas. This is Dan Rather of CBS News. The man you are seeing here is the doctor who has been attending Texas Governor John Connally.
I'm Dr. Robert R. Shaw, professor of thoracic surgery at Southwestern Medical School. Because of this position, I accepted the responsibility of taking care of Governor Connally for the
Doctor, let's start all over again. Thank you very much.
I'm Dr. Shaw, professor of thoracic surgery at Southwestern Medical School. Because of my position, I accepted the responsibility of taking care of Governor Connally following his injury. I want to say at the outset that the condition of the governor is quite satisfactory in view of the injury that he has sustained. He seemed to have been struck by just one bullet, which entered the right posterior chest, close to the shoulder blade, and coursed downward along the chest wall, taking out and fragmenting a portion of the fifth rib on the right. The bullet then emerged from the chest, evidently struck his right wrist, fracturing the lower portion of the right radius, and then entered the left thigh where it was spent. The thigh wound is trivial. The fracture of the radius should heal without difficulty or without further disability. Our major problem was the sucking wound of the right chest wall, because in making the wound of the chest, the fragments of the fifth rib became what we refer to as secondary missiles, and these caused a considerable amount of tissue damage in the point where the missile emerged from the chest. When the wound had been enlarged in order to remove damaged tissue, the lung could be inspected. It was found that there was a tear in the middle lobe of the lung, which had to be repaired. There was also a small hole in the lower lobe, undoubtedly due to a small rib fragment. This was of no consequence. The major problem was a matter of completely controlling all bleeding points, removing all damaged muscle and tissue, and then securing a tight closure of the chest wall so that the right lung could be re-expanded. The governor's condition was good during all of this. He was perfectly lucid before anesthesia was started. And from what we know about his injury and his condition at the present time, we have no reason to believe that he won't completely recover without significant disability of any sort.
How long do you feel that the governor will be required to stay in the hospital here, Dr.?
The length of time that he will be in the hospital will be determined more by the clearing of the bruise to the right lung, and I would estimate that this would be in the neighborhood of 10 to 14 days. This doesn't mean that this injury will be completely clear by this time, but at least we should have a good idea as to the trend of the clearing. The trend of the clearing, whether it is clearing or not. Yes.
Doctor, did you know the president is dead?
We didn't mention the president to Governor Connolly. No.
Now, he has Albert surgery at the present time and resting in his room, is that correct?
No. They are now taking care of the compound fracture of the right radius. As soon as that is finished, he will be taken to the recovery room where he will be carefully watched until he has regained all of his vital signs. Now, his vital signs are good now, but we like to observe them for a period of time. This is a routine measure until blood pressure is stable, respirations are satisfactory, and until the governor is fully recovered from the anesthesia. In other words, he's fully conscious, responding rationally to questions. This is being taken care of. The bullet is in the leg. It hasn't been removed. This is a very insignificant factor, though. It will be removed. Left eye, but there's no significant injury to the left eye. Before he goes to the recovery room. I think it would be advisable. No, this is really a reconstruction of what must have happened, but assuming, of course, we know that the governor was in a sitting position. We know that the wound of entrance is alongside the shoulder blade here, that the wound of exit was here. We speculate that his arm perhaps was about in this position and that it fractured his arm here and then went on with him sitting into his left thigh. This is a matter of trying to reconstruct the trajectory of the bullet. He was shot from above and he was in a sitting position. So we feel that this is all one bullet. That no. Yes, the lung was collapsed. However, don't stress that point. The lung can be easily re-expanded. It's like a balloon. You can let it down and blow it up again. The lung is now re-expanded.
Was he given a large quantity of blood?
We felt that the governor had lost approximately 1,500 cc's of blood. We counted in units, 500 cc's to a unit, and this is what has been given back to him. 1.5 quarts.
Sir, we missed the early part of your diagnosis and your explanation. Would you do it once more for us? His general condition?
Let's wait, please, sir, until the other questions are finished, and we'll consider that. Any other questions?
What are they?
This is Dan Rather in Dallas, Texas. What you have been watching is the official briefing from the doctor at Dallas's Parkland Hospital who has been attending shot Texas Governor John Connally. As you heard, Governor Connally is in serious but not critical condition. Back now to CBS News headquarters in New York.
As they did, as you have heard, for Governor Connally of Texas, the doctors did all they could for President Kennedy. Oxygen, blood transfusions, an operation to ease his breathing, But as you know, there was really nothing that they could do for the president. The president's body, President Kennedy's body, will lie in state at the White House tomorrow, according to the Speaker of the House, John McCormick. All day tomorrow, the president's body will lie in state. McCormick says he thinks the body will then be taken to the Capitol on Sunday to remain in the great rotunda of the Capitol until about noon on Monday. Further plans are indefinite, but it's understood that the actual funeral services are going to be held in Boston after the lying in state in Washington. Traditionally, presidents who die in office have lain in state in the rotunda. Pentagon officials expect the funeral to be a full-dress state ceremony, and preparations are now going ahead on that assumption. Officials of the Military District of Washington said that the president's family will determine the timing and the scope of the ceremony, which now will be held, or it's believed will be held, that they will wish to have held in Boston rather than Washington. All this planning, of course, is tentative. President Kennedy's body is still en route by air from Dallas, where he was slain by an assassin today. Also aboard the presidential plane with the body were Mrs. Kennedy, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson. The plane is due at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. A well-informed source said that first the president's body would be taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital tonight, and the lying in state would begin tomorrow at the White House and then at the Capitol. President Johnson will go to the White House. As you may have heard, former President Eisenhower has issued a statement on the death of President Kennedy. The film has just arrived, and here is President Eisenhower.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel. And we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief, but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
General Eisenhower, will the nation be all right in a few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
Thank you, Mr. President. History have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, in McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, down when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me.
because Americans are loyal. And it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Why, this itself almost, well, is one of the contributory causes to that war. And, but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation that where our freedoms are allowed, or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready I mean, everybody is, you might say, capable of doing this if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow and the weekend?
Look, I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
CBS News will continue its live coverage throughout this evening. We'll be back in 30 seconds after a pause for our stations to identify themselves. We continue now our reports on the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas. CBS News White House correspondent Robert Pierpoint was with the presidential party in Dallas, and we switch to Mr. Pierpoint now with Dan Rather at station KRLD-TV in Dallas.
CBS News White House correspondent Bob Pierpoint has just returned from Parkland Hospital after taking part in the motorcade in which President Kennedy was shot and going immediately to Parkland Hospital, one of the first reporters on the scene. Bob, I know that you've taken copious notes on the whole day, so why don't we begin at the very beginning when the Kennedys arrived in Dallas this morning?
Well, Dan, I would like to use my notebook to refer to because there are so many impressions, tragic ideas and thoughts going through my mind, and I think I need to refer to this, but I would like to make the point, first of all, that this day has a terrible ironic quality about it all the way through as you look back on it. The president's arrival here in Dallas was so warm and so friendly. Everything seemed to be going so well. He and Mrs. Kennedy had gotten off to a good start in Fort Worth this morning. The president had spoken to a crowd outside his hotel. He was in a very good mood and humor, and as we came into Dallas, we had, of course, expected that there might be some protest signs, some signs against the president, but the crowd generally was larger than we had expected and friendly and enthusiastic. Everything seemed to be going very well, and we went down the main street of Dallas. I think it's even called Main Street. Tremendous crowds along the sidewalk cheering and waving flags and shouting, and then as we turned the corner to go by a small park right on the edge of town, we heard 3 shots. We heard the explosions. We didn't know what they were. And suddenly the motorcade slowed a little, and then the president's car picked up speed very quickly and disappeared. And, of course, I think all of us at that moment feared something, but we didn't even dare express it. So I would like now to switch to a description that I took notes from on Mrs. Connolly, the governor of Texas' wife, who was sitting in the same car with the president and with her husband and with Mrs. Kennedy at the moment that the shots were fired. The president's car was just going under an underpass, about to turn onto a freeway, and Mrs. Connolly says that she was discussing with the president what a warm welcome the Kennedys were receiving, which is one of the terribly ironic things about this whole tragedy. She says that she had just said to the president, "You can't say Dallas is not friendly to you today." And she heard a shot fired, and she feels that that first shot was the one that struck the president. Now, all the indications we have are that the president never felt a thing, that from that shot, which entered his throat and probably came out the other side, the back of his head, from that moment, he was unconscious until he died. Mrs. Connolly says that immediately her husband, who was sitting just in front of the president on the right side of the car in the jump seat, turned, and as soon as he turned to the president, he himself was also hit. Mrs. Kennedy grabbed hold of the president, and Mrs. Connolly grabbed her husband, and Mrs. Connolly does not recall that the president said anything, nor does anyone else from that moment on. Mrs. Connolly says that immediately a Secret Service man in the front of the car next to the driver grabbed a telephone and said, "Let's go straight to the hospital." And at that moment, of course, the president's car sped off and left the motorcade, hit speeds of 50 to 60 miles an hour to the Parkland Memorial Hospital, which was just a few blocks away. Now, at the hospital itself, there were some eyewitness reports to the president's arrival there. By the time the car reached the hospital, the president was lying on the back seat of the car with Mrs. Kennedy had his head cradled in her lap. And the eyewitnesses say they were not able to see the president's face, but they did see blood, of course, all over the front of his suit, his chest. And he was, at that time, completely motionless. He was lifted out of the car and placed on a rolling table and rolled into the emergency ward of the hospital with Mrs. Kennedy walking along beside him. A short while after that, I arrived at the hospital where, of course, doctors and nurses and Secret Service agents and police were all hurrying back and forth, everyone showing strain, a great deal of worried whispering outside the room where the president was being operated on. As we've heard later, 8 to 10 doctors actually worked frantically to try and save the president, but apparently there was very little hope from the time he arrived at the hospital. About 1 o'clock, rumors began to spread that the president had died. We were not able to confirm this. 2 priests did go in, and I talked to them as they emerged from the room where the president was, and they said that they had administered the last rites. I said, "Is he still alive?" And the priest said only his condition is critical. So at that time, I do not know whether he was dead yet. But there were other indications. For instance, Senator Yarborough of Texas, who had been with the party, told me that he felt the situation was extremely serious, and then he began to break down. And I asked him if the president was still alive, and he said, "I just don't know." A short while later, the assistant press secretary, Mr. Kilduff, came out and said that he had an announcement for us. We gathered, and he told us that at 1 p.m. the president had died of a gunshot wound. From that moment, of course, officially, interest had to turn to Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And a short time after that, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, President and Mrs. Johnson, hurried out of the emergency ward of the hospital, surrounded by Secret Service men, were rushed into a car and off to the airport. About 15 minutes after that, a bronze casket was brought into the emergency ward of the hospital, and while we waited, a white ambulance drove up. I saw the president's secretary, that is the dead president, President Kennedy's secretary, Mrs. Evelyn Lincoln, standing out there by the white ambulance, and of course she looked like she was in a state of shock, as I think all of us were at that time. I saw Mrs. Kennedy's press secretary, Pamela Turner, face very drawn and pale as they waited for the casket to be brought out. At, I would estimate, about 1:40, the bronze casket was borne out. There was a large crowd of officials around it, Secret Service agents. I caught sight of General Clifton, the president's military aide, carrying one corner of the casket, and I saw Mrs. Kennedy walking along beside it. And they rushed it out to the airport. It was put on Air Force One, the president's plane, where the swearing-in ceremonies were held for the vice president, who is now President Johnson, and they departed the casket, Mrs. Kennedy, and the new president of the United States for Washington. This is Robert Pierpoint in Dallas, and now back to CBS News in New York.
These are the fragments of history as they begin to be assembled on this day of historic tragedy. We here at CBS News have been on the air continuously since the first announcement. We will continue to stay on the air. This is a special announcement by Frank Stanton, president of the Columbia Broadcasting System. In respect for the feelings of a shocked nation, the CBS television network and the CBS radio network will carry no commercial announcements and no entertainment programs until after the president's funeral. CBS will continue to bring all the news relating to this tragic event, memorials and special broadcasts, and all other news of importance throughout this period. A statement by the president of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Similarly, in Britain, both the BBC and the commercial television network there have suspended all their broadcasts and are playing funeral music in tribute to the late President Kennedy. There have been many developments, great and small, all over the country and all over the world. There have been statements with which we can't keep up by so many people, from the heads of nations to small people in every country in the world. In the United States, the major stock exchanges of the nation shut down today, minutes after the fatal shooting of the president. Stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange took their worst tumble since the so-called Black Monday in May of 1962. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 21.16 points to 711.49. That's in Black Monday in the May of 1962, it fell 34 points. The Yale-Harvard football game has been canceled. A joint statement by the president of Harvard, Mr. Pusey, and the president of Yale announced the cancellation of the traditional Yale-Harvard football game. Now, here is the scene at St. Patrick's as the memorial to President Kennedy is concluded.
Hold that shot.
This is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, where a memorial mass has been said for President Kennedy. We have many statements from all over the nation. Many things have happened. I've just announced the cancellation of the Yale-Harvard football game at Madison Square Garden. The cancellation has been announced of a prize fight between Alan Thomas and Johnny Persall because of the president's death. Roosevelt Raceway in Long Island has canceled its harness racing card. The border between the United States and Mexico was sealed immediately after the assassination of President Kennedy by U.S. authorities, probably to forestall any possible escape by the assassin of the president from Dallas, Texas. In London, a group of 61 New York-bound airline passengers, almost all of them Americans, were about to board their plane when somebody cried that the president was dead. "Who said that?" shouted a middle-aged woman. The passengers reacted with shocked disbelief, as they did in so many other places. Americans caught in strange parts of the world learning of of the death of the president. In Rome, in Vatican City, Pope Paul VI prayed tonight for the soul of the president. The Pope received the news only a few moments after the president had died. President Kennedy, of course, was received in audience by the Pope in June during a visit he made to Italy. United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson paid tribute to the late president. Here is what he said.
The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love peace and freedom and justice will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in the time to come. May God help us.
There has been much eloquence in reaction to the death of the president, and much inarticulate grief expressed by simple people throughout the world. Statements by important people continue to come into us. One by Governor George Romney of Michigan, which was issued in Omaha, Nebraska, where he's attending the governor's conference. The president's assassination is a horrible, immeasurable shock and a national tragedy. It is imperative, said Governor Romney, that the assassin or assassins and any influence behind them or associated with them be identified. Upon behalf of all Michigan citizens, I extend our heartfelt grief and sympathy to the president's family. Let us unite, said the Republican governor of Michigan, behind our new president and give him loyal support. Our grief should renew our dedication to serve our country. White House sources say that President Kennedy's body will be taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital when it arrives in Washington shortly after 6 o'clock tonight, Eastern Standard Time. Vice President, or the habit is still strong with all of us. The new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will go directly to the White House from Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland. A statement come to us by J. Irwin Miller, President of the National Council of Churches. It begins, "This young man, our president, rests now in the care of his heavenly Father. He came to responsibility in a time of difficulty and peril, and he led the nation with courage and dignity." I should repeat to you a statement about the intentions of this broadcasting network made by Frank Stanton, president of the Columbia Broadcasting System. In respect for the feelings of a shocked nation, the CBS television network and the CBS radio network will carry no commercial announcements and no entertainment programs until after the president's funeral. CBS will continue to bring all the news relating to this tragic event, memorials and special broadcasts, and all other news of importance throughout this period. As the first shock reaction to the president's death begins to be absorbed, people are trying to assess not only the influence of this tragic event on the affairs of our nation and the world, but to make an assessment of President Kennedy's role. An assessment of President Kennedy's role as an international figure now from Marvin Kalb in Washington.
Charles, possibly we might start that assessment by pointing out that the chief adversary of the president, the Russians, Nikita Khrushchev to be quite specific, they're 8 hours behind us in time, and it was quite late in the evening when the news of the president's assassination reached Moscow. I suppose that millions of Russian families were seated in their living rooms, in their dining rooms, watching television, when suddenly there was a most unusual thing on Moscow television, a bulletin from TASS, the Soviet news agency, all the way from New York. It said that an attempt had been made on Mr. Kennedy's life, and TASS said by persons believed to be among extreme right-wing elements. Within the hour, TASS came back with another bulletin that Mr. Kennedy was dead. No one knows exactly where Premier Nikita Khrushchev is at the moment. A few days ago, we know that he was in Kiev and he met there with the Danish Prime Minister. We can be reasonably sure that there's one major topic on his mind, just as on the minds of most people at the State Department, today, tonight, and probably throughout the weekend. What effect will the President's death have upon East-West relations? People at the State Department asked that question today, and it's all too soon to come up with any kind of an answer. It's hard to gauge, really, what their reaction is going to be and what the reaction of the Soviet Union is going to be. Officially, undoubtedly, from the Kremlin and from Nikita Khrushchev as Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, there will be expressions of regret. Probably from Nikita Khrushchev, expressions of sincere regret, because since the Bay of Pigs, at the time of the Bay of Pigs, rather, he really did not have, it is believed, a very high regard for John F. Kennedy. But at the time they met in Vienna, he learned to respect the President. He learned to respect the President's determination to protect the interests of the Western world and the interests of the United States. Khrushchev is brought up in a political system that comes to believe that individuals make policy, not institutions, which is the way the United States believes. That very quickly after the death of one president, another man can assume total responsibility for the foreign policy of the United States. That is now the responsibility of Lyndon Johnson. But in a Soviet context, it's too uncertain, too difficult to try to assess this entire thing. And I would suspect to questions like, will the Russians begin to take advantage of the situation in the Western world, in underdeveloped parts of the world, now that there is uncertainty and some confusion and bewilderment here in Washington? I would suspect that the answer is no. Nikita Khrushchev understands, just as John F. Kennedy understood and Lyndon Johnson must now come to understand, that in the United States and the Soviet Union there are two nations which command enormous destructive power. And it is in the hands of the man who runs the White House and the man who runs the Kremlin to determine just whether this power is going to be used. And I would really suspect that at a moment like this of uncertainty in East-West relations as well as uncertainty in the United States, the Kremlin will not seek to take advantage. I think that the Kremlin will probably sit tight for quite some time and make very, very certain of just in which direction American foreign policy is going to move. The chief architect, the most experienced man in commanding American foreign policy now is the Secretary of State. He was on board a jet liner an hour after leaving Honolulu for Tokyo for a very important economic conference there with the Japanese. When the pilot called back and said, "Mr. Secretary, the President has been shot in Dallas," he ordered the plane turned around immediately to be flown to Washington. That plane is now expected here at about 1:15 tomorrow morning. A few minutes later, Undersecretary of State George Ball called the Secretary, said the President had been shot. The Secretary said he knew that the plane was already on its way back to Washington. 3 or 4 minutes after that, the Secretary learned by radio that the President was dead. He will be in at 1:15. That's all from here. Charles, now back to CBS News in New York.
The new President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, with whom Premier Khrushchev will have to reckon from now on, is flying back to Washington at this moment. He will arrive in about 40 minutes, a little after 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Already, President Johnson has begun to gather into his hands the reins and responsibilities of government. Immediately after he was sworn in the executive cabin of the presidential plane at Dallas's Love Airfield this afternoon, he said, "Okay, let's get this plane back to Washington," and they took off. After they land in the Washington area this evening, President Johnson will go directly to the White House, where he will meet with Defense Secretary McNamara and White House National Security aide McGeorge Bundy, and then confer with bipartisan leaders of the Congress. The other cabinet members, or at least many of them, 6 of them, as you heard, were on their way to the Far East and are now airborne, returning, will not arrive until later. Secretary of State Rusk is with them, and of course, the new president, Mr. Johnson, will confer with them later. The president's body which is also being borne back to Washington by airplane, will go first to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, and then tomorrow it will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House. A CBS mobile unit is standing by now at Hollywood and Vine Streets in Los Angeles. We switch there now to CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt. I'm afraid we don't hear the sound of Mr. Kuralt's voice. We'll try to repair that technical problem as he reports on the mood in Los Angeles, shocked as every part of the nation is. I'm sorry about that technical problem. We'll seek to repair it and then hear from Mr. Kuralt later. Already in Washington, the protocol which every great nation has in order to cope with events of this kind has begun to get into motion. The new president is on his way, has already scheduled meetings with Secretary of Defense McNamara, top aides, congressional leaders. The president's body will lie in repose tomorrow in the East Room of the White House between 10 and 6 p.m. in the morning. And an elaborate schedule for viewing and the paying of respects to the late president has been set up. The family will come in at 10 o'clock in the morning into the East Room of the White House. At 11, President Johnson, the new President of the United States, Speaker McCormick, former U.S. presidents, President Truman, President Eisenhower, President Hoover, members of the executive branch of government who are presidential appointees will be ushered into the president's resting place in the East Room of the White House. Then in the afternoon, the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. Later, members of the Senate and House, governors of the 50 states and territories, and later still, the diplomatic corps will pay their respects. Then, the president's body will lie in state in the traditional ceremony that takes place for presidents who have died in office, will lie in state in the great rotunda of the Capitol. Then, it will be taken to Boston, where the actual funeral will take place according to the wishes of the family, which have still not been expressed because the sense of grief and these problems have not yet been spelled out in any careful or orderly way. There is time for that as the machinery of a state funeral begins to take its course in Washington, and then later in Boston, the president's home, where the actual funeral will take place. We have a statement here from Sir Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of Britain, the first honorary citizen of the United States, who called the assassination of President Kennedy a monstrous act. The loss to the United States and to the world is incalculable, said Sir Winston. Those who come after Mr. Kennedy must strive the more to achieve the ideals of world peace and human happiness and dignity to which his presidency was dedicated. There has been a statement from the heads of all of the great states of the world as they expressed their grief at the death of the president. In Paris, Charles de Gaulle, a soldier himself, said President Kennedy died like a soldier, under fire, for his duty and in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, ever the friend of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory from Charles de Gaulle. In a message to Mrs. Kennedy, the French president said, "The immense sorrow which has stricken you moves my wife and me from the bottom of our hearts. Please accept our assurance that we are with you in thought and in prayer. President Kennedy," said General de Gaulle, "will never be forgotten." Another message to the new president, Lyndon Johnson, pledged the faithful and confident friendship of France for the United States of America. On this day of history, with so many confused and, we fear, so many repetitious developments, it might be fitting to recapitulate a little bit of the things that happened. A chronology of President Kennedy's final hours, which began at 8:45 this morning as the president walked bareheaded and without a coat through a misty rain into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel, Texas. He spoke there, and then at 9 o'clock he went to a breakfast At 10:30, he went on to the Air Force for his flight to Dallas, and then began the tragic series of events which you know. He moved from Dallas out to a trade mart where he was to address a bipartisan group, and on the way, he was shot. Governor Connally of Texas was also shot, and now the new President of the United States, President Lyndon Johnson, is on his way to Washington and to take up the reins of duty at the White House. A moment ago, we sought to bring you reaction from Charles Kuralt in Los Angeles. We believe now that our technical difficulties between here and Los Angeles have been corrected, so let's try and switch back to Hollywood and Vine and CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt.
Even at this late hour, people are still passing this corner in Hollywood with tears in their eyes. I saw a woman a few minutes ago walking along with a baby in her hands, and she was clutching the baby and tears just pouring from her eyes, obviously trying to comfort the child in an attempt to comfort herself. This great city of Los Angeles is such a diffuse place that it's not always clear, these moments of mass emotion, but this city is overcome this afternoon by a multitude of personal griefs. You can't see very much change in the face of the city, but you can see what has happened written in the faces of the people. People sitting at the benches on the bus stops, or just staring straight ahead, not saying anything to anyone. All the religious leaders of Los Angeles have listed services in memory of the president. For people who want to find an expression for their sorrow, there's a solemn pontifical mass of requiem, a memorial service at the University of Judaism, a prayer service tonight at the First Baptist Church in Los Angeles. And as for the secular officials, the politicians of the city who have commented, most of them seem to be assuming, on the basis of whatever facts, that the death of President Kennedy is attributable to extremists. For example, City Councilman Tom Bradley said, "This indicates the dangerous degree of hysteria and hate which has consumed some elements of our nation." And another councilman, the city council was in session when the news came, Billy Mills, said, "There's no doubt in my mind that he was shot because of the positions he has taken." The John Birch Society, which opposed all of his positions, it has commented too, in the person of Congressman John Russolo, who said, "No matter how Americans